The instructional designer and online learning librarian for Oklahoma State University. And she is going to be presenting on the legislation as applied to you. And I'll be keeping up with the chat and letting her know if there are any questions while she's speaking. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. If you give me just 1 second to situate my screens here. All right. And while I do so, I just want to say thanks to Adam. He is just a wealth of knowledge. And if I could just plug Able Tech again, I have gone to them with questions, projects, issues, used their resources so many times over the years, and I have learned an incredible, ridiculous amount from them. And now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. All right, here we go. Okay, everybody sees that okay?
Yep, we sure do.
What was that?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to keep the chat up over here as well, but I welcome my co-host and moderator to assist me should I not see something in the chat. Okay. Oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide here too. Okay, so the legislation as applied to you. And this is specifically now for, you work at your institution in various roles. You could be in administration, you could work for individual departments, you could work with faculty. We're going to run the gamut here of what your role will be in your institution and how it applies to you. So I'm going to try to hit a bunch of different points here to make sure everybody's included. But do please let me know if I don't cover something that you're curious about. And I also want to apologize. I am currently sick, but I've got cough drops and hot tea and everything. So hopefully my voice holds out for this session. All right. Before we begin, I just want to briefly acknowledge that diving into accessibility headfirst can feel incredibly daunting. You might be overwhelmed, you're not sure where to start, and maybe you haven't even started because you're not sure where, there's just too much. So I just want to acknowledge that you're not alone. It is a lot if you look at it all as one piece. And it's not going to happen overnight, and that's okay. Our goal here today is to equip you with those knowledge and skills, the tools to add to your toolkit so that you can make a plan and move forward. And also to note, if you're already doing this, awesome. Keep doing it. Hopefully we can add to your toolkit today. All right, so our objectives for today, we're going to go look at what accessibility means for our purposes here, what it means for you as staff in your institution, and hopefully you'll feel a little bit better about working accessibility best practices into your normal workflow over time. Okay, so I think it's always important to, kind of frame our conversation with some definitions so we have that shared understanding. I think Adam did a fantastic job opening for this session because I build on it and even mention a lot of the things that he mentioned during his session. And so hopefully we can dig a little deeper into each of those. So Adam shared this definition of accessibility, where in a nutshell, it's ensuring that everybody, including people with disabilities, can receive, understand, and act upon information and services as easily as everyone else. That there is no us and them, that it's everybody has access. You will see me use this abbreviation throughout my presentation. It's A11Y, and that's an abbreviation for accessibility. That's what it means when you see it. And it's what's called a neuronym, which is when you use numbers that represent letters, and there are 11 letters between the A and the Y of accessibility. So it looks like ally, and it stands for accessibility. I want to provide this additional definition by the Office for Civil Rights. And they've used it in various resolutions, accessibility resolutions that they've published over time. And a resolution is when they go into an institution, they help them become accessible after a complaint has been filed. And they've established this definition, and that's that a person with a disability should have the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability. And this should happen in an equally effective manner, an equally integrated manner, and with substantially equivalent ease of use. That's all to say that there shouldn't be a glaring difference between what we offer our students with disabilities and those without disabilities. It should all kind of flow together. And so what we're going to talk about a lot today is ensuring that accessibility becomes a foundational part of our practice so that we can provide these equally effective, integrated, and equivalent opportunities for our students with or without disabilities. So some common accessibility practices that you have probably seen or been a part of at your institutions is that, accessibility is something that's thought of after the fact. You add it at the end of the project, at the end of the design process, because you have to, because it's compliance required, for you have to do X, Y, Z. And so you finish whatever it is, and then you say, oh yeah, I need to make this accessible. And a lot of times, usually that just goes to one person who is the make things accessible person. And they handle everybody's accessibility after the fact. And, it's not really spread out. It's just an afterthought kind of a thing. Unfortunately, doing it that way can lead to a lot of terrible things. It can lead to unequal learning opportunities. You have students or other people that you work with who have to go and ask for access to something that others just get as is. It can lead to othering, unfortunately. The systems that we have in place right now, and a lot of the ones that we use even today, were put in place before accessibility was even a thought, before ADA was written, before the Rehabilitation Act was written and put in place. And so they didn't include accessibility as just part of what we do. It was added as an add-on. So when we use this term to make something accessible after the fact, whether it's usually pretty unconscious, what we're doing is we're othering those with disabilities. We're putting them in a different bucket and saying, you are outside the norm. You're not part of us. You're extra. And that is, I apologize. I lost my place in my notes. So that can lead to these unequal learning opportunities for students with disabilities. It can lead to furthering harmful stigmas and, the worst, basically the worst things that could happen. It leads to inefficiencies unsustainably. It's unsustainable long-term. Yes, Allie says the best way to help people feel included is to include them. Yeah, very basic. If you are giving all of the accessibility work to one person to do over after it's done, it will require so much remediation that could have been a quarter amount of time if they had just done it from the start. So let's think about if we could just kind of flip the way that we think about accessibility practices. If you want to improve the students' overall experience and acceptance and the way that people are viewed, and to eliminate those inefficiencies, we need to reframe the way we view it as something that's foundational to everything we do, and that every single person in an institution has the responsibility for. Everybody, nobody is excluded from it. Think about when you learn to use Microsoft PowerPoint, whether it was in school, continuing education, in the workplace. Alt text probably wasn't an option then to add, right click on something or, go to the tab where you can add alt text to an image. It probably wasn't an option then. And so it just wasn't part of what you learn. But now we are going to learn how to do those things, and it's going to just become part of what you do, your normal processes. This is going to lead to not only more equal learning opportunities, but it's going to greatly increase the efficiency, the sustainability, and even the retention of students. There are studies that show that when students with disabilities are just offered accessible learning materials and situations from the start, their retention sees a huge increase. So on that note, thinking about how we are going to start talking about accessibility as foundational to what we do, every single thing, an ongoing process, everyone's responsibility. What is this Title II ruling? What does it mean for us? Adam touched on it in his presentation, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper. So here's a very brief summary from the ruling. Technical standards were established for making accessible the services, programs, and activities offered by state and local government entities, which is you all, to the public through the web and mobile applications, also known as apps. So what does that include? I'm so glad you asked. Well, in a very tiny nutshell, almost anything digital. Title II defines web content so broadly in what it covers that basically if it's digital, it will most likely need to be made accessible. So I want to dive into some of these definitions here. Web content is defined, they define it in the document. And again, going back to basically anything digital, and Adam mentioned this in his presentation, it's basically documents, web content, mobile apps. This applies to anything internal and external, wherever you view it on, however it's communicated. Those things need to be accessible for people with disabilities. This documents. And I just want to also mention as, an FYI for those of you who, okay, my internet did something weird. Are you guys, am I still good?
You did drop out for a second, but you're back now.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I just want to mention that the coding part of websites, of software that you use, any of those things that are the medium or the way that it's presented, the coding part of that also is included. And as we'll see in a bit, that you might have varying levels of responsibility for it, but I just wanted to also mention the code and how things are built is part of this as well. Conventional electronic documents. I will use this term. This is one that they use throughout the ruling as well. And these are the things that you use almost every day, I'm sure. Portable document formats like Adobe PDF files, and word processing files like Microsoft Word, presentation files, that could be Apple Keynote, Microsoft PowerPoint, and spreadsheets such as Microsoft Excel. So what does this not include? And again, Adam touched on this, there are 5 exceptions, each with qualifying criteria, which we'll go through in just a second. You still need to provide that equal or equivalent material on a case-by-case basis, even if you fit into an exception, which, as he mentioned, the exceptions are only good until up until the compliance date. But you still, if a student or an individual requests accessible materials, you still have to provide that equal or equivalent version of it. A best practice is if you're, and I forgot to change the language in here, but if it's not just teaching and learning, but if you're requiring it in your institution for people to use, go ahead and just make it accessible to start. Include that in your remediation plan, include that in your steps going forward. Don't just wait for somebody to say, you have to do this now. Go ahead and make it. Again, we're offering that equal experience for students with disabilities where they don't have to out themselves and say, can I please have a version that I can access myself? So these exceptions, this is just them in summary. We're going to go through them individually. And I just want to preface it, like Adam said, I am not a lawyer. I do not play one on TV even, but so please consult with your institution's legal departments, research these for yourselves. Please do read the rulings, but I will give you just overviews of each one, and I will keep my eye on the chat because I know a lot of questions come out of this. So the first one is this archived web content. And there was a question, I believe, about legacy content that came up during Adam's session, and I am happy to talk about that now. But I just want to start by saying, again, in a nutshell, if it is actively being used by people regularly, it should be accessible. Excuse me one moment, I just need to cough. Okay, I'm back. So this exception covers content that was created before the compliance date, or if it reproduces, let's say, images, audio recordings, videos of things that were created before the compliance date, those are also included in it. They need to be used for only reference, research, and record keeping. That's the language they use in the ruling, and I'm going to dissect that a little bit in a second. And it needs to be kept in a special archival area, saved in a special area, not just in your general filing, digital filings. And also, you can't have changed it since it was archived. So let's say it's after the compliance date, and you have these materials that were made, before the compliance date and whatnot, and somebody is using it, and or even if they're not using it, if you update it with new information, it now is no longer an exception. It must be accessible. So I say that we're going to dive into this one because they're at institutions. There's a lot of confusion between, does this mean things like student records that we don't use but we're legally required to keep? Or does this mean the institutional archives where we keep the oral histories, the videos from past, from whatever specialized materials that the institution keeps? There's a difference between those. And what it comes down to, again, I'll say, is how is it being used when you have that question? If it is, you are archiving, you have archived Canvas records for a student that you have to keep, I would say don't worry about making them accessible at this point unless somebody is going back to actively use it. If it becomes actively used, let's say that your university or your institutional archives, such as in your library, is doing an exhibit that they from let's say the Tulsa Race Massacre, and they are bringing out materials that they have in their archives. It is now, even though in library terms that would be used for reference and research, we're using it differently now. We're actively using these materials, and people, patrons, students, people in the institution are going to actively use it. It now needs to be accessible. So that's why I kind of want to differentiate between archived, as in not using it anymore and you just keep it because you have to, versus something that you keep for posterity's sake that will be and may be used again in some way or another. And I see here a comment, even with exceptions, archived web content should be included in your accessibility plan, even if it's the last priority. Melissa, I could not agree more. And exactly what I have in my notes was that comment right there. As your institution goes about making a plan for remediating old content or including accessibility into your practices going forward so that things are just made accessibly, you can prioritize what order you're going to go into. And the things that people don't really use ever, but may use, that might be lower on your priority list, but it should still be on your list if people are going to use it. Now, let's say you created a flyer for an event in 2014, and you just have it in your archives, your university archives for whatever, or institutional archives for whatever reason. Nobody uses it except one person who says, what happened on that day? And they want to go look it up. That would meet the exception. They're not using it for anything new. Real-time metaphor example from Allie in the chat. Even the Great Pyramid of Giza has wheelchair access now. Yep, exactly. Thank you, Allie. Okay, before I go on, I want to just stop and ask, are there any questions I can answer about archive web content? Because I know that this is something that in every session I've been in, people want to know, what does it mean and when and how? So I'll do the creepy teacher thing and just let it be silent for a second, and feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. Okay, I will keeping an eye on the chats.
Well, I do have a quick question.
Yes.
Can you give any sort of estimate or guideline as to how long one might expect to have to, like if I have 20 PDFs that are currently not accessible, is there any sort of time estimate as to how long that would take?
That's a good question. The remediation that you'll have to conduct will be an individual basis. So every institution will be different, as will every department and every individual's work that they oversee. It's all going to be different. One PDF could take 2 minutes to remediate, or it could take, 3 days. It just depends on what it is. And there's a lot of different resources and ways to go about determining the process for doing so. And so with this exception here, I wouldn't get caught up right now in this moment on how long will it take, but more so the necessity of making things available to people with disabilities. And so are they going to be using it? Are they not? If so, yes, let's include it right now in our remediation plan, because we want to offer them that equal experience. When I get a little bit in a couple slides, I'm going to talk about plans for moving forward, and I'm going to hopefully address it a little bit more there. Thank you very much for your question. Okay. Yeah, I see something like 3,000 PDFs publicly available. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in a second for what the heck? How do you do this? Okay. Exception 2 includes pre-existing conventional electronic documents. And those are other ones that we talked about a couple slides ago, your Word documents, PDFs, PowerPoints, Excel spreadsheets. If you have these documents and they were available before the compliance date, they meet that exception that you don't have to address it immediately. But if you go in and update that document with new information, it is now no longer covered by the exception. Because some of these will carry in beyond the compliance date, but that doesn't mean they need to stay that way forever. Let's say, for example, faculty would have a syllabus that they use in their class every semester. They attach it in their LMS or however they distribute it to students. And all they do every semester is they go in, all the information is the same, but they update the semester on there from spring 2024 to fall 2024. Now it is no longer covered by the exception. It must be made accessible. And again, this will harken back to things like, what if it's, records that we keep, their archives, but they're Word documents or they're PDFs. Again, it goes back to how is it being used and has it been edited? Any questions I can answer about those things? Okay, I just want to reiterate, if you're requiring students or if you're requiring students or colleagues, staff members, if you're requiring its use, go ahead and make it accessible, because now you're saying you must do this. Okay. Ooh, I see lots of chatter here about the Adobe PDFs. Yes, lots of worries about that. Okay, so exception number 3 is non-contractual third-party content. Unfortunately, third-party vendors are not required to provide accessible materials by law. They can hand it to you with no accessibility whatsoever built into it, which is very unfortunate. I hope soon the burden also shifts to them to do this because, again, foundational accessibility is the most important thing, and that it's everybody's job to do so. But this exception, which again only applies until the compliance date, and then after it no longer does. But if you are using content that a third party posted or created, and you are not contracted to them in any way, fashion, or form, it is one of the exceptions. So, and again, the keywords here are the contractual, licensing, or other arrangement. So for example, sometimes you might use a vendor to create and host a website. That would not fall under the exception because you are contracted to them. They created it for you, and so it must be accessible. One thing that I would like to mention with this is that it is very important if any of you or any of your staff are part of procurement, that you right away get training on working accessibility into your contracts. There are lots of resources out there of people who have written sample contracts, sample language, sample questions you can ask vendors to do this, but any contracts going forward should have accessibility language in it to include that. And that is probably your best way to ensure that from that end, you're getting it accessible product. Okay. What a non-contractual third party. Okay, more examples. So let's say I believe the example I gave in the ruling is, let's say you have a website and you open up a post for commenting, and somebody, from the peanut gallery comes in and writes some comments on there, and it's on your website, but they're writing it. You're not contracted with them in any way, fashion, or form. And so what they write there doesn't have to be accessible, even if they include images or whatnot. But let's say that, you bring in, because this came up last time, a guest speaker to the institution, and you have a contract in place with them. You are paying them or otherwise, providing some sort of payment for them to be there. You have that contract, you're licensed with them. And this person uses materials now. You have contracted for these materials to be used. Those would need to be accessible because you're now on the hook because you have those arrangements in place. Again, reiterating, if you are requiring people to use something in any way, fashion, or form, make sure it's accessible. Okay. Does that make sense, or would you like more examples? Because I know somebody asked for that in the chat. Okay, so yeah, Clarissa, thank you for mentioning that. If you have course content, let's say that you're requiring students to use linking out to another website, but you're not contractually obligated to use them, if you're requiring students to use it, you need to provide that accessible version of it. If you're just including it as like a resource or something, honestly, I can't say for certain that it would be not part of the exception or not. But yeah, again, going back to make sure people have what they need. Okay. Exception 4, individualized password protected documents. Think about if you are, and okay, so let's talk about the criteria first, getting ahead of myself. Documents, those conventional electronic documents, such word processing, presentation, PDF, or spreadsheet files. And it's about one individual person, property, or account. It's very specific to that person, property, or account. Not very, it is. And it's password protected or otherwise secured. At this time, it does not have to be accessible. An example would be you are providing a billing statement to someone in your institution, to a student perhaps, and it is a PDF. It is just about their account, and they can only access it through their password protected system, like your LMS or content management system, that at this time would not have to be accessible. It will have to be, but again, we are prioritizing. Let's prioritize these on the bottom end for accessibility. But at this time, it would not have to be. Yep, Bursar bills, max sent letters to student. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much for those examples in the chat. Sorry, I'm not finishing my sentences. Okay, exception 5, pre-existing social media posts. So it's pretty self-explanatory. If you have social media posts that are up there made before or posted before the compliance date, you don't have to go back and redo all of these posts. Again, going back to if you're requiring it be used in some way, or if you're updating them with new information, make it accessible. It's no longer covered in the exception. Okay, we've gotten to the end of our exception, so I'm going to give another awkward teacher pause here for more questions to come in, either in the chat or unmuting yourself. Okay, we're going to move on. So what does this mean for me? I want to quickly just note, you've likely heard the term accommodation if in your institution, and that's when a student has a registered diagnosis with an accessibility office, and that accessibility office documents that, and they create specific approved learning environment or content adjustments for them to meet their needs. Instructors are notified, and those instructors must provide those accommodation. This is very one-on-one basis, and it has to do with, again, compliance with their registered disability. Accessibility, on the other hand, as we've been talking about, this is something that you just do. It's part of your toolkit. When you're doing anything, you are including those accessible design principles. You make things universally accessible to as many people as you can, and every single person has a responsibility for it. I saw some questions come into the chat here. Let me pause real quick to check that. Oh, there's a lot of questions. So if we could have my colleagues keep an eye on those, and at the end, if you could just maybe summarize a couple of them so I can come back to the ones that are in there.
Yeah, no problem.
What was that?
I said, no problem. We'll
Oh.
summarize them.
Thank you, Alicia. I appreciate it. Okay. Oop. Okay, so some typical institutional web content that you likely encounter every single day or occasionally, and will span different roles. Could be websites, digital records, as we've mentioned, such as like Bursar reports and whatnot. Those conventional electronic documents we've been talking about, content management systems and the content within them, emails, Zoom meetings, images, videos, audio clips, digital signage. If you have signs that are digital, those are also included in this. And then kiosks or wayfinding. These are just some examples here. And I also want to note, as we're talking about this, that there are layers here of digital, of web content. There are the mediums that you use, such as websites, software, content management systems. And then there's the actual content that you might create and put in there, such as images, videos, the emails that you write, the text of the emails that you write. There's different layers of web content, as well as varying layers of responsibility for each. Let's say that you are a staff member who is writing an email. You likely have no control over the email system that you use or its capabilities. That's somebody in IT would probably have set that up and what its capabilities are. There's going to be different layers of responsibility, which again is why everybody needs to be responsible in their own area for it. So I just want to note that as we move forward, that you don't have to do every single thing, likely because you can't. Now, in an institution, the typical ways you would see this in teaching and learning, there's the LMS, the learning management system. and everything that goes in that, the text, electronic documents, videos, sound bites, images, animations, interactions, the assignments, anything that you link in there. And one big one that I'm going to mention here is those linked licensed resources, such as journal articles, the database content, ebooks, streaming content, all of those things that come from vendors. These are all web content that needs to be accessible. Third-party applications, apps, online synchronous sessions, and if you use a digital whiteboard within your in-person courses. These are all things that just examples of what needs to be made accessible for students to have that equal learning opportunity and to just make it a one foundational accessible experience for all. Okay. So, but how? At this point, you're probably like, Christina, this is too much. You've listed too many things. I can't even comprehend one of the exceptions, let alone everything else you've said today. Yes, I agree. It is a lot. If you have not started jumping into accessibility, this can be a lot right now. The way that you do this, small chunks and over time. Rome was not built in a day, and you're not going to be an accessibility master in one day. But if you are every single day adding to your practice, practicing it, making it part of the steps that you do, just like I talked about PowerPoints with alt text. Now you use that as a step that you include when you're creating your PowerPoints. It just becomes part of what you do. And over time, you're building up your sustainable accessibility knowledge and skills. If you tried to do it all at once, you'd probably cry or something. It'd just be too overwhelming. But so then when do we learn this, Well, start now or keep going. If you have not jumped into this yet, today's the day. Start now. Whatever you are working on after this conference, hopefully not during it, but after it or this workshop, Google how to make emails accessible. Start with one thing. Keep going every single day. It should become part of your daily work. And I'm not saying that this is all you do, but again, small chunks over time. You should start now. So again, I mentioned those layers of support, depending on who you are in the institution, who is going to be responsible for what. Well, if you are an institutional leader, you should start now consulting with accessibility experts. Get them to come in if you can, or if you have them already in-house, have them look at your current setup, what changes can be made. Consult on that, on next steps forward. Train procurement staff immediately. I mentioned this earlier. Your vendor contracts will be crucial for ensuring you have accessible content. So get those procurement staff members immediately, get them in training, finding resources, and start including it in your new contracts, as well as attempting to update existing vendor contracts right now, top of your priority list. There are several change management plans out there in the scholarship, in practice, that can be used. Some that are specific to higher education, some that are specific to business, but can be used in higher education. I will link some of those in the resources. But because what you're doing is you are overseeing change management at your institution, and doing so with a plan in place will ensure that it can, again, over time and in small chunks, take place. Providing funding for training and developing those processes and new documentation will be crucial. And funding could mean that you're giving them your staff time to go and do these things, or it can mean you're bringing somebody in or paying for for training opportunities. Document, document, document. Do not rely on institutional knowledge, because as soon as you get a new person or somebody leaves, you'll be very sad that you didn't document. So as a part of doing every single thing that you do, document, document, document. And then again, allow for time and space and grace with yourself and with others. This is a huge undertaking and it's going to take time. I have heard from people who are involved in the ADA and from the Office for Civil Rights that most important thing that you can do right now is to start working on that plan. Have an active plan in place by the compliance date showing that you've already started it. You already have a prioritization, you already have a plan, you are actively training people and remediating content. Have that plan in place. Okay, so let's say you are an individual, you've stepped into this, you're like, that's great. I have nothing that I can do personally because I'm just by myself or just in my department. You can still take small steps. If you have experts available to you, consult them. I will say Oklahoma Able Tech is a fantastic place to start if you have no clue other than that. Or even if you have a clue, they're a great place to start. They are a wealth of resources. They have training available now. Start there. If or if you have in-house experts, talk to them. One project, one task at a time. If you are working on a Zoom, setting up a Zoom meeting, look up Google. Just start Googling if you don't know where to find resources. Accessible Zoom meetings. There's so many options or resources out there to help you. So focus on one thing that you're doing, one task, add accessibility in so that it becomes part of your process. Again, document as you go. I cannot oversell using the built-in checkers that are in your software, that are in your different programs and apps that you use. I think I saw it mentioned in there about Blackboard and Canvas having accessibility checkers. Use those. Use the ones in Microsoft Word in their products. Always use them. But I will mention again, well, not again, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but I will mention there is no substitute for a human looking at the content and making sure it's accessible. A built-in accessibility checker cannot determine if the alt text you've added makes sense. That's going to be dependent upon the person who is authoring the content. They'll know that best, not a machine. Some of the worst alt text that I've seen comes from the AI guessing in Microsoft products when it wants to fill in automatic accessibility or alt text for you. Do not rely on that. But again, use the built-in checkers and then always have that human check afterwards. That time and space and grace, allow it for yourself individually. It is so important. So to learn these specific things, there's a lot of things you can do. Google, as I've mentioned. There are tons of free and paid webinars, tutorials, trainings out there. I've linked some of them in here. And I know that my colleagues will as well. Talk to your colleagues. Use the knowledge that's around you. And join accessibility listservs. That's a steady flow of information coming to you and opportunities coming to you every single day, which I've also included in my resources. Briefly, I do not want to dwell on this, but I do want to mention, because institutionally this is talked about a lot, the undue burden and conforming alternate versions. So first, conforming alternate versions, that is a separate version of web content that is accessible, up to date, contains the same information, functionality as the inaccessible web content, and it can be accessed in similar ways. They mention this in the ruling and the update, but this does not mean that you can just offer this instead of accessibility. This needs to be used in very, very limited technical or legal circumstances where offering it in an equal fashion so that it's equally available to everybody would cause issues. Again, this needs to be very limited use. An example of this would be you have a web page that cannot be read by a screen reader. And so you have a PDF that is attached that people can click on and then access the content there. That would be a conforming alternate version. And again, it should not be used unless there's a very, very specific circumstance, and it has to be technical or legal. Undue burden. This is your absolute last resort. Avoid it at all costs. They've made it clear in the ruling that this should not be a go-to in any way, fashion, or form. It is a fundamental alteration, and then nature of a service, program, or activity of the public entity, or an undue financial and administrative burden. Meaning, if you do the work to make something accessible, it will fundamentally alter your service, your activity, your program, and it will give you so much of a financial burden or administrative burden that you cannot handle it. They have made it very clear that this should not be used as a reason to not make things accessible. That this is your absolute last resort, and you will have to prove in writing from the head of your institution that how it was an undue burden, to the extent that you're providing a very documented or very what's the word, detailed documentation about why. So I wanted to mention these words because I know institutionally these have been mentioned with ADA in the past. Do not rely on them. Let's focus. The focus should be on everyone's job, making a plan going forward. Every day we're working on accessibility. So how do we do this? We're going to use the 4 core skills for digital accessibility that Adam mentioned earlier. This is a fantastic way to compartmentalize, oh man, what do I need to think about when I'm looking at these things? Thinking about the structure of whatever it is that you're looking at and working on. Creating equivalent experiences, making content readable, and using color carefully. Let's talk about a few different instances of key points here, just kind of drilling it down, all of those things we've talked about. What should you as an individual be thinking about when you're thinking of using text or conventional electronic documents? Well, you're going to find these probably in your LMSs, your content management systems, when you write emails, create digital records, teaching materials. When you're I have email on there twice. Sorry about that. When you're creating digital signage, when you're creating kiosks and wayfinding, you're going to be using these types of things, text and conventional electronic documents. So again, focus on that structure. Use programmatic headings and good organization. As Adam mentioned, this doesn't mean just formatting a header in a document so it looks bold and bigger than the rest of the content. So you look at it and think, oh, that must be a section title. It means that in Microsoft Word, you're going to the styles pane and using headings 1, 2, 3, and so forth and so on. In your LMS, you're choosing the headings options. It'll either say H1 or heading 1, and so on and so forth. That is key. Make sure that you are making your text, your conventional electronic documents readable. Use plain language. One thing that came up another time was somebody said, well, what if I have a law course? And I can't remember if Adam gave this example or not. I apologize. If you have a law course and you are speaking about, the legal requirements of such and such regulation and whatnot, do you need to use plain language? And no, the context will matter. You need to use legal terms in that instance in order to teach the content or to communicate the content. Just know your audience and know the content area that you're speaking of. Those fonts, don't use big, windy, curly fonts that are hard to read. Use simple ones. 12-point minimum size if it's a document. A good rule of thumb is if you are giving, let's say, a presentation on like a digital whiteboard where people or projecting a presentation and people are in a room, use at least 28-point font so people can see it from a distance. And again, that left alignment is important so that it doesn't make the lines difficult to read. Color contrast that Adam also mentioned. Focus on making sure that there is appropriate color contrast available. That your colors, it might look, if you look at 2 colors together and you say, I can see that just fine, that might not actually be accessible to all people. That's why it's always important to use something like WebAIM's contrast checker to tell you, because there's an actual calculation that it does, an actual ratio. Math that I would not want to do in my head. Video and audio. You can find this in your work. You can add it to websites. You can find it in your content management systems, your learning management systems, digital signage, teaching materials, your kiosks, Zoom. These can be all over the place. Your key points here. Your videos always must include closed captions. providing a transcript is great if you can. And when I say transcript, I mean a literal document that goes line by line of all the things that are said in the video. And sometimes, usually it has like timestamps or will, say who's speaking when. That is also great. Use descriptive language to describe what's on the screen when it's important. If there is something happening in the video that verbally nobody is saying anything about it, people who are blind or low vision will not be able to take that information in. And so you want to make sure that you are working into the script what's happening on screen when it's important. If you have audio, sound bites or whatnot, transcripts of the audio, or if it's a video with no video on it and just audio, you can use closed captions, but that transcript will be super important. If you are doing a live video or audio, such as a Zoom session like right now, use automated transcriptions that are available to you. There are other services that you can use that are available to try to get the best transcription possible. But yes, definitely use automated transcriptions. Some tips. Use the built-in automated transcriptions, such as in Zoom. I know that Canvas has options for this as well. Zoom does. If you want to provide a recording to somebody, you can use Zoom to record yourself and then access the closed captions that they create after the fact. But always make sure that you edit these closed captions or transcriptions before posting. Always, always, always. There have been some really unfortunate content that's been passed on to people when those captions and transcriptions were not edited. YouTube also has automated transcript or closed captioning as well. Absolutely recommend that. You can upload videos to YouTube and it'll do it for you. But again, edit. When it comes to images, always use that alternative text. There was a lot of questions coming up before about complex alt text, and we will get to that in a second. What you want to focus on with alternative text, called alt text, always is making it concise and conveying the goal or purpose of the image within its context. So the goal or purpose and the context, that's what you want to convey. If it's a image of a red shirt, but it doesn't matter that the shirt is red. What matters is that the shirt is a button down. Don't provide unnecessary information that will just add to what somebody has to listen to. Only provide what's most important that goes back to the goal or purpose of the image and then how it fits in within its context. It should be very concise, 1 to 3 sentences max. I think we're going to hear more about that later. But there are some opportunity or some resources available to you. Those complex images, let's say you have a graph that you have in a Word document and you cannot just build it into the Word document itself. It has to be an image. And all of the information in there is important for people to see. What you can do is that is considered a complex image where the alt text on the image itself would tell the user briefly what it is and where to find the full information for it. You could add it, for example, as an appendix or in the notes of a PowerPoint slide. This is only when it's too much to fit within it and you do need to convey all of that information.
You have about 5 minutes left.
What about, could you say that again?
5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you so much, Alicia. Well, we are now to the questions part, and I have given you guys so much information here. So let me know, what questions are there? What have I missed in the chat? Because it was going so fast I couldn't even keep up.
So back in the chat, there was a lot of questions about like third-party publishers and whether or not they had to make things where they were accessible. And if a student like purchases a textbook, is that a type of contract? And there was a lot of back and forth about that. So if you could just kind of summarize your thoughts and maybe add them, or it looks like there were several people that were contributing to that might help.
Yeah, I can give a quick overview, and then if my colleagues would like to jump
That'd
in,
be great.
anything. So when you have, let's say, for example, a textbook, which is provided by a vendor, but the university is already choosing to contract with them to provide these materials to the students. You have a contract already in place with the bookstore, for example, so that they can provide it, or they have to the student has to create a login, if it's content management, like a Top Hat or something like that with Pearson and whatnot. You already have a contract with the university in place simply by using it like that. And so that vendor is not required to make it accessible, but you are required as the university or as the institution, as the practitioner, to make sure it is accessible. That's why that contract language is so important. One area that comes up a lot is, what if it's an open educational resource, which is could be created and hosted by an institution, by an individual. It is on you to make sure that that is accessible for your students still, or whoever your patron may be in your role in the university or the institution. But again, if you are licensed with that person in any way, it does need to be accessible.
Okay, what if the university provides something like UJ Panorama or Blackboard Ally and puts the responsibility back on the student to download whatever alternative versions that they need? Does the university still have to make the stuff accessible?
So I think there are two different situations here. One is that the vendor is, to the best of their abilities, providing to the general population a resource that is accessible, that will work with a screen reader, that has captions if there's a video, has acceptable color contrast. All of those things should be accessible, written into the contract language. That's what you're expecting from them. There may be instances where that might not be enough for an individual with a disability, such as they have to use very specific assistive technology to access it. In that case, there are vendors who create accessible textbooks and other resources that are made to work with those machines. It might not be the type that you would see just in general. For example, a Braille textbook. That's not something that you would generally see in every student's hands, digitally or in person. But it is an accommodation that would be made for that instance. And so it's all going back to those WCAG web content guidelines. What does it say? What does level AA require of you as an institution, as an individual? And so there's that, and then there's the additional accommodations on a one-on-one basis. So what students see should be accessible. If there's a special situation, that can be addressed after the fact.
Somebody just asked, when creating documents with services like Canva, what kind of accessibility functions do they provide? I know that they now offer text functions.
Yeah, this is why it's really important to not only learn these skills over time, but also be critical of the tools that you choose to use and how the accessibility is built into it, if at all. I know previously Canva was a big perpetrator of inaccessible content because it wasn't built in, it wasn't an intuitive thing to even address. You mentioned now that they've added the ability for alt text functions. Always look to see what the accessibility functions are of the tool you're using. That Googling a tool plus accessibility is really helpful, because you'll usually get some lists that are out there people have created to remind you, here's what you need to pay attention to. So yeah, just be very critical of tools that you use and how they function with accessibility.
Well, there was a lot of really good discussion, and we really appreciate the awesome job that you did. And I think Priscilla is going to kind of give a summary of how the rest of the schedule is going to go for the rest of the afternoon.